A moment like this gives us a chance to kind of stop time. It's as if we just pause time for just a few moments, and we have a chance to look back and to look forward with this gift of stopped time. It's almost like the pendulum has just swung to a still point before it continues on its way. The work that we have to do is to face all of the good things that we've experienced, all the good times and blessings, without ignoring that there have been a lot of hard times too. Because reflecting on the good does something different for us than reflecting on the bad. And both have a lot to offer. When I think back on the good, I think about the images I've seen, the photos and the essays that people have written about what this church was like 50 or 70 years ago, when there were masses every hour and they were all full, when the school was absolutely bursting at the seams, and so even though it was only 30 years old, they had to double the size. I think back to the stories about how the Sisters of Mercy were so crammed in their limited convent space that the pastor was stressed trying to figure out where to put them all these teachers. And those were the days when just about every Catholic kid in town went to St. Patrick's School. Until 8th grade, because that was when they had to graduate. And then they would take the train. They took the train up to Albany so that they could go to Catholic high schools there. Some to Cathedral, some to VI, some to Holy Names. But when they were done with their education, you knew where they were going to go next. They came back to Ravenna to settle down. They got married and then they took over their family business, or they started a business of their own, or they went to work at the mushroom plant, or the cement plant, or the railroad. There have been lots of times in our history where there were just too many parishioners for the pews. I wonder if those who built this church in 1918 ever wondered, gosh, should we have made it just a little bit bigger? We have all that land back there after all. Donna did me the favor of going through all of the record books this week to take a look at just some of the statistics that might give us a glimpse into what this church has meant for the people of God here in Ravenna over the years. Over the past 100 years, there have been 4,868 baptisms here. Were you one of those? Raise your hand if you were one of those baptized in this church. Over the past 100 years, there were 1,589 marriages celebrated here. If you were married in this church, would you show that to us? Oh. Over the years, there were 2,280 funerals in this church. If you attended a funeral for a loved one in this church, would you acknowledge that for us? What does this church mean to us? It's not hard to see. I think that's what St. Paul was getting at in the second reading when he said, when you realize how many people have experienced the grace of God, and you realize that it's more and more all the time, it just overflows in thanksgiving and joy. There is so much to be grateful for from these past 100 years in this home. But there were hard times too. And it would be foolish of us to ignore that because they have a lot to offer us. The good times, when we look at 100 years worth of them, actually get to be distilled down. It's like getting a bunch of fresh fruit and getting ready to make preserves out of it. We've got to boil it down so it gets really concentrated. And when you take all of those good times and you boil them down, you get a really concentrated form of accumulated joy. So one of the things we need to be feasting on today is savoring the good times and enjoying that accumulation of really concentrated, distilled joy. But the bad times have a lot to give us too. It's not joy that they give us, but they give us a different perspective. Sometimes we romanticize the past to the detriment of right now. There was a priest in our diocese who died about 5 years ago, but he was well known to most of the priests here, Father Tom Powers. He was a good buddy of Bishop Hubbard's. They had been friends in seminary. He was a very funny man. I think the last pastorate he had might have been at Father George Fleming's parish in Valencia at St. John the Baptist. But he had a famous phrase that he always said when people would get too sentimental about the past. Oh, the good old days. Oh, everything's terrible now. He'd say, oh, yeah, the good old days, formerly known as these trying times. That's how it is. That's how it is. There were real hardships in the past 100 years in this parish. This was a fairly new building when we were in the heart of the Great Depression. Can you imagine the strain on all those people trying to make the mortgage payments on this beautiful church during the Depression? Can you imagine the strain on the priests and the people here when there were people in this town that were not just struggling to make ends meet, but were actually hungry? Were actually starving. Can you imagine what it was like during the time of World War II? Maybe some of you have faint memories of that time when so many of our young people had a final mass here with their family before they were shipped off to Japan or to Europe to almost certain difficulty. Many of them returned home in caskets, and their funerals were celebrated right here in this church. Others came home changed forever and needing to find their way back. That was not something that we can be too whimsically sentimental about. Those were hard, hard times. There was a time when money was so tight here because of all of the students in the school that needed tuition assistance that a creative pastor said, we've got to figure out how we can gain some more income for this parish. So they took over a mission. It wasn't possible to start a mission in Queeman's Hollow. I think all those people were just as happy to come here. So they took over the mission in East Durham, Our Lady of Knock. I think we tricked them into that by telling them we were from St. Patrick's. But if anybody had seen how many Italians were in this parish, they probably would have been on to us. Isn't that amazing to think of taking over the shrine in East Durham in the Catskills to be able to help our students afford their Catholic schooling? And you know, these stories don't have to go back 50 or 70 years. A business manager who was here not terribly long ago told me that when things were kind of lean back in days not terribly long ago, there was a rock in the top drawer of the business manager's desk. And on one side of that rock was a bunch of bills, and on the other side of the rock was another bunch of bills. The ones in front of the rock were the ones that needed to be paid immediately or people would know. The ones behind the rock were ones that we were still figuring out. We'll get those paid eventually, but during lean times, we weren't always in the black. And some of those times aren't that long ago. It's good for us on a day like today to use the readings just that were given to us by the church for today. These aren't special readings, but how perfect was it that God chose the reading of Adam and Eve, who lived in a place that we call paradise, but who had hard times. You know, just as all of those good times wind up getting distilled down like a bunch of fruit being turned into preserves, and the result is this really concentrated form of joy, the same thing is true for the hard times. We have to boil those down, and we have to get them into a really concentrated state. And when we have them in this distilled, concentrated form, what we have is wisdom. We look back to the good times so that we can tap into that joy. And we look back at the hard times so that we can tap into that wisdom. So that's what it's like for us to look back right now. Such joy and such wisdom. So what's it like to look ahead? Well, it's interesting because we inherited so much from our ancestors. We've inherited so many good things. And of course, we've inherited some challenges too. But our charge as the Catholic people of Ravenna and Queens right now in 2018, I propose is different in some ways than it's ever been before. There are many ways that it's exactly what it's always been. But in other ways, we have to be adaptive to the world that we live in. Many of you have heard us talk over and over again about the mission statement adopted by the visioning body of our parish, the Pastoral Council. We have spent a lot of time figuring out what is it exactly that God is calling us to do with the particular challenges here in Ravenna and Queens right now. And they became clear to us after a lot of prayer and reflection. We embrace people seeking a spiritual home. We serve those in need. And we grow our parish through the involvement of youth. Those are our three tasks right now. And I would propose to you that one of those three is something we have always done. It's the second one. This parish has always served those in need. That food pantry over there is a testament to that. The number of families that have been fed from that parish, that food pantry rather. The number of people every month who've never come before, but now have discovered the lifeline that will help them. Our thrift shop is an amazing gift that we give to the community. And it's been a gift that parishioners in crisis have turned to, people who never thought that they would need help, but whose house burned down, and then were able to come and get clothes for the first week from the thrift shop that we run in the school. We've always been a parish that helped those in need in the Great Depression and right now. But those other two, those are different tasks than we have ever been asked to undertake before. We are being asked to embrace those who are seeking a spiritual home. Can you imagine that being a goal 50 or 70 years ago? I talked to a lot of people who maybe were from a different faith tradition when they first came to St. Patrick's. And they tell stories that are familiar all over the world of when they came to marry their Catholic sweetheart and were told, ooh, you're Methodist. We're going to have to celebrate this on this other side of the rail. When people came to our church, they were welcome as long as they were interested in becoming Catholic. But if they weren't, this really was not a place for them to come because the dividing lines were pretty strong back then. And if that makes you wince, it's good for us to remember that we can never judge yesterday's people by today's knowledge and understanding. That's not fair. But how interesting that God is saying, I want you to reach out to those seekers. I don't want you to make them beg to come in here. I want you to beg them to come in here and give us a try and see what this is. I want you to be so in love with this faith that it's your favorite thing to talk about and share with others. I think our third task is similar to that first one. Just as we have never had to embrace those seeking a spiritual home before now, I'm not sure it was so important to try to persuade the Pape children into going to church when they were kids. I don't imagine that Billy Pape put up much of a fight. That wasn't done then. You didn't need to involve your kids. The way you involved them in church was letting them live another day. They were lucky. And that's maybe true for a generation ago or two, but even George Fleming, who's here right now, Father George, was telling me when he was coming of age in the 70s and the 80s, the way he showed rebellion to his parents was going to a different mass time than they did. And that's not so long ago. And now, here we are, embracing, involving, begging. It's a different world. And God is saying, I want you to do things differently. I asked the Israelites to do that when they found themselves in slavery and woke up one day and knew that this was no longer where they belonged. And I wanted them to do something they'd never done before, journey through the Red Sea to get free to the land I had for them. No one had ever done that before, but that was what I wanted that generation to do. And this is what I want your generation to do. Mother Teresa was once asked, "What is the biggest problem in the world? Out of all the problems, which one do you think is the biggest?" And she answered immediately. She said, "The biggest problem in the world is that people draw the circle of their family too small." They don't include enough people in the picture when they think of family. And if you think about generations ago, we did the same thing. Sometimes we're even tempted now. When I think of family, I think of people with my last name. Or maybe I think of people who are registered members of St. Patrick's Church. Or I think of people who live in Ravenna or Queens. But Jesus says, I want to take this to a whole new level. Did you hear in the gospel what Jesus said when they said, "Hey, your mother and your family's outside"? His mother, who we love and adore, was outside saying, "Jesus, I'd like to see you." And how did he respond? "The circle of my family is way bigger than that. I'd love to see her, but not to the exclusion of these people." Who is my family? Anyone who's seeking God. That's my family. We are being called to live that reality of the gospel right here and right now. Pope John the 23rd was that famous pope, the jolly one, who initiated a lot of changes in the church in the 1960s during the Second Vatican Council. He said something beautiful about St. Patrick's. I don't know if he actually named our parish or said Queemans. I bet that's hard to say in Italian, but he said something that is truly about us. He said a parish must always be like a fountain in the middle of a town that is always flowing. And at that parish fountain, everyone can come and take a drink. So on this 100th anniversary, let us drink deeply of that concentrated joy and that concentrated wisdom. Let us be grateful for all that has gone before us. And as St. Paul says, let's allow that to just overflow like a town fountain filled with joy.